Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 248. I am your host, Eric Worrell, and this week we're going to be talking about some recent news stories that have popped up in the news from the last week. We got a funny story coming from Bleacher Report, and if you're familiar with Chad Ochocinco Johnson, formerly of the Cincinnati Bengals, funny story involving him and a tenant landlord scenario. We have a story coming from Germany, some radical housing ideas to stage a housing revolution in Berlin. We'll get to that later in the episode. More news coming from St. Paul. There seems to be a lot of news coming from there out in Minnesota on how landlords can shave 40% off of property taxes. And then a really interesting story from the New York Times on the rise and fall of the multi-million-dollar Airbnb scheme happening in New York City. We're going to get back to all of that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So as usual, you got just me, Eric Worrell, your host here. Steve is working on some other projects here at Rent Prep. And if you recall, last week I've been given some updates on products that we've been working on here at Rent Prep. If you're not familiar, we are a background check service located out near Buffalo, New York. We service landlords all over the United States. And one of the new products that we released just within the last month is the ability to do a judgment and lien search on SmartMove reports. We are a reseller of SmartMove. Same price through us, same product, except we can add judgment and lien searches. Those were stripped in 2017 from credit reports, so that includes SmartMove reports since it's owned by TransUnion. Well, as of this week, we are now offering our verification services that you can add to SmartMove reports. So what that does is you can call, you can have our screeners call the current and previous landlord to verify information provided on the rental application, along with calling their employer to verify employment, salary history, and also full and part-time status. And we ask a bunch of questions that our in-house screeners will annotate inside of your reports that you can read through. And that's all available through us at rentprep.com. And the cool part about those SmartMove reports is you can bill the tenant directly for not only the report, but also those add-ons that I mentioned earlier. So with that out of the way, I wanted to get into some of the recent news stories here. This first one, I'll start with a fun one. This is from bleacherreport.com. If you're familiar, that's a sports website. Kyle Newport wrote this on February 23rd. The title says, Chad Johnson pays man's rent to avoid eviction, wants to play landlord in FIFA. So former Cincinnati Bengal receiver Chad Ochocinco Johnson makes no secret that he loves everyone. So when he sees someone in need, he does what he can to help out. So on Friday, Johnson had tweeted out to his followers asking them how their day was going. And one individual said, facing eviction, but it's Friday, so, and with a little emoji of like a guy just kind of saying, whatever, kind of thing. And Chad Johnson screenshotted a PayPal payment over to this guy. His name is Chris. He paid for the guy's rent. And he also said and proclaimed that he is the self-proclaimed FIFA king, and he's willing to settle things with the landlord in an unusual way. He said, tell your landlord next time we fall behind on rent to play me in FIFA for the balance, 100%. So Chad Johnson, if you ever watched his 11-year career in the NFL, he was an unusual guy. He made 6 Pro Bowls, but kind of did some crazy things. Apparently, he has a habit of giving very large tips when he goes out to eat. And the tips are based on stats that he has done throughout his career. And it's not just his NFL playing career, but also how he's doing on FIFA. So one image that I'm looking at here, and I'll link to this Bleacher Report article in the show notes here for episode 248. He wrote on a $18.17 where is this at? I don't know if it's Applebee's maybe. He left a $209 tip because he once had 209 yards in a game in 2007, which I find it hysterical that he writes this on the tip that he had that many yards. Then he takes a picture of it and tweets it to his followers. And it's one of those things where it's kind of funny because you're like, what an egomaniac. But at the same time, he's making somebody's day. Who cares? He's giving a huge tip, He tipped on another one. It looks like he tipped 300 yards because his best yardage game. And then this was my personal favorite. He put a $100 tip and he said he scored 100 goals in FIFA today. So he's very proud of his FIFA prowess. If you're not familiar, FIFA is a soccer game that you can play on Xbox, PlayStation. So there's a fun story there. So if you have a tenant behind on rent, find Chad Ochocinco. His Twitter handle is Ochocinco, and tweet at him and say, hey, I'm really good at FIFA. Let's do this. So that'd be pretty funny if he actually held up his end of the bargain on that and played some landlord for rent on FIFA. So next story here comes from citylab.com, and the title is Berlin Builds an Arsenal of Ideas to Stage a Housing Revolution. I think my favorite part about this article that was written on February 21st is the author's name. His name is Fergus O'Sullivan. I'm going to guess on how it's said, but it's Fear Gus is his first name, so I'm just guessing there. But basically, I thought this was worth sharing. Probably don't have a lot of listeners out in Berlin area, but some interesting stuff going on out there as they're trying to combat the growing housing crisis and the affordability crisis for renters. So it says here, I'll read a little bit of this to you. As Berliners grow increasingly frustrated with rising rents, there's a question making the rounds in local politics that could seriously shake things up. Should there be a limit to how much a housing landlord can own? So that's why I'm sharing this story with you guys today. We hear a lot about, rent control and stuff like that, but I haven't heard too many articles talking about how much actual real estate a landlord can own. So following months of intense debate, the German capital is considering whether landlords with more than 3,000 units should be barred from operating in the city. So naturally, opinion polls show a majority of Berliners favor such a move, and activists are about to start preparations for a referendum on the subject. The proposal is just one of several moves in a city that could be on the cusp of housing revolution. Over the past few months, the German capital has been trying out several plans to keep housing affordable. In effect, these plans would transfer large sections of the city's rental homes from private owners to public sector. It did later in the article talk about how they've actually purchased the city in 2018, purchased some housing. I believe it was like about 300 units. So it's interesting what's going on over there. The one thing that comes to mind with this story from CityLab is I think of companies that get so large where they go public. And I think we've all heard this story before. A company is trying to build, and one thing they have to do is offer an IPO, an initial public offering. They go public. But at the moment that happens, or if they have private investors even, the company becomes indebted to those investors or to their shareholders. And I think we've heard stories of companies that do this, but then when that happens, all of a sudden the product starts to be cheapened because every move that they're making is no longer about making the product or the company the best it can be. It's about acquiescing to those shareholders and making sure that those shareholders are getting a return on their investment. Kind of sounds like that a little bit in Germany. What they're discussing is that these large landlords with 3,000 plus properties, they're not worried about the quality of life for the tenants or that the properties are in good working order. They're worried about the return on their investment. I mean, they're obviously, the people who own these companies are probably never even visiting most of these apartments. So I get where they're coming at from that, why they're concerned with some of these mega landlords and why that they are not creating the best possible living situations, and they are instead creating the most amount of profits they can. And the way you can do that as a landlord, unfortunately, is by not reinvesting in the property, raising rents, and trying to squeeze every penny you can out of the property. I know that we probably have some listeners who are like, yeah, that's what being a landlord is for. Sign me up. But I personally think that kind of is shirking some of the responsibility you have towards your tenants who are your clients to give them a great place to live as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens out in Berlin with this story. Another instance of government kind of getting involved in trying to curb rising rental prices. The next story here comes from twincities.com from Frederick Mello. And the title here says, St. Paul landlords can shave 40% off property taxes if they keep rents affordable. So I thought this one was interesting because it's not it's a little bit of a twist on traditional affordability, and where, usually the government's stepping in, and whether it's Section 8 or a program like that. In this particular case, it says that with rental vacancies being so low and rents being high in the city of St. Paul, that they're offering property tax discounts to landlords who keep at least 20% of their apartments affordable to low to moderate income households. So what this looks like in real rental terms is a 2-bedroom apartment rented out to a family of 4 for $1,273 per month may qualify for a 40% discount on property taxes. It's a very specific number. I don't know where they come up with that, but with the goal of preserving existing non-subsidized housing that happens to command below market rents. So the way this might work is an example that was presented by the city was a 120-unit apartment building might currently pay $123,000 in annual property taxes, so just over $1,000 per unit. If the property owner agreed to keep 24 units affordable for 10 years, their taxes could drop by about $10,000 per year. So previously, landlords interested in the state's 4D tax classification could apply through the city on a case-by-case basis, said the Planning and Economic Development spokesperson. So I just thought this one was interesting in it's taking a different approach as far as instead of doing a voucher program where the government's essentially paying for a portion of the tenant's rent, it's paying in the landlord on the back end through reduced property taxes and giving them incentives to keep their rent controlled. As you know, an investor, I think that sounds better than just the government stepping in and placing rent control, and they're giving you the option, essentially saying, hey, if you want to, crunch the numbers yourself, you can, essentially rent control some of your units, but we will hit you up in the back end and give you a break on property taxes. So something to consider if you happen to be in St. Paul, but also something to consider as a real estate investor. And you never know, one of these programs, ends up working out well and it kind of spreads to other cities. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Okay, the last story we have here for you today, this was in the New York Times. This was by Luis Fer Sadurni. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Sadurni would be my guess on the last name there. This was on February 23rd. That was when this was posted in the New York Times. The title of the article is Inside the Rise and Fall of a Multi-Million-Dollar Airbnb Scheme. It says that multiple misleading identities, more than 100 host accounts, and 18 corporations were created to run an illegal hotel business in Manhattan, according to a lawsuit filed by the city. So I thought this was really interesting because Airbnb is definitely something a lot of landlords think about, where they might be looking at a property that's in a touristy spot, or maybe it would fetch a pretty good price on Airbnb. And do you want to, switch up that property from a rental property to a short-term rental that you could host out on Airbnb to potentially make more money? But then, of course, it requires more of your time and management. So in this particular story, though, it's about these corporations that are trying to kind of outsmart the city in some of the ways that they tax hotels. So I'll read a little bit of it for you here. It said from the outside, there was nothing especially notable about the small white building on the corner of a cobblestone street in Tribeca. That was until recently. It was a crucial location in a sprawling empire. Beautiful loft, Tribeca, 4-bedroom, 2 bath, sleeps 10, read the listing on Airbnb for one apartment there. 2 of the 3 apartments in the building were popular with tourists looking to stay in one of Manhattan's most desirable neighborhoods. At $600 a night each, they were a bargain for a large group. But they were also illegal, part of an elaborate real estate scheme to make millions by circumventing state and local laws and Airbnb's own rules. The building on Greenwich Street was part of a larger enterprise that made more than $20 million in revenue by unlawfully renting 130 Manhattan apartments to almost 76,000 guests through Airbnb, city officials said. The plot was geared towards getting around city regulations that are intended to keep blocks of apartments from being turned into makeshift hotels that avoid lodging taxes and oversight. The crackdown in the empire last month was a milestone in the escalating battle between Airbnb and New York City, the company's largest market in the country. Airbnb condemned the exploitation of its platform, but that the scheme showed how the home sharing site has given opportunists a new kind of side hustle. So the story goes on a little bit further to kind of talk about how there's been clashes with Airbnb in various cities all over the world, including LA, Amsterdam, Paris, Vancouver, British Columbia. And now they're actually seeing that there's a city in Spain called Palma de Mallorca, became the first city in Spain to ban Airbnb. So basically what's happening is there's, at least in New York City, there are neighborhoods that it's impossible to put a hotel in. The city forbids it. And now instead what's happening is these corporations are infiltrating they're getting these rental apartments, and instead of renting them out, they're turning them to Airbnb. They're not paying the taxes that would normally be paid that a hotel would have to pay. And because of the fact that they're short-term rentals, they're charging a good buck. They don't care if there's 10 people staying in a 4-bedroom apartment. Not unusual probably for New York City anyways. But they are getting around this and making a ton of money, even with the Airbnb costs. So it said that in all, more than one Airbnb host accounts and 18 corporations were created to run an illegal hotel business that stretched north from Tribeca to Soho, Gramercy, the Upper East Side, and Harlem, according to a lawsuit brought by the city. So this will be really interesting to see what happens with this. The story goes into further detail on how it all began in 2012. And if you're interested, you can find the link in the show notes. And there's a pretty interesting image as well, where it's kind of showing the locations of these Airbnbs and how much profit was being generated by them. And it's a really, really interesting deep dive in exposing Airbnb and how it's being used illegally in the city. As far as how it worked, it said the scheme required leasing scores of apartments. Some landlords claimed they were deceived, renting apartments to Mr. Beckman and his partners without knowing the units would be used as hotel rooms. So it said, for example, Mr. Beckman signed leases for 2 apartments in another East Harlem building in late 2017, according to a separate lawsuit. And it said a day after signing the lease, the apartments were on Airbnb under the host names Cedric and Tom and Lisa. So the rent for the apartment was $3,225 a month, but it was on Airbnb for $250 a night. Hypothetically, Mr. Beckman could cover a month's rent by filling it with tourists for about 2 weeks. So interesting thing to think about. I'm sure this is something that as a landlord you need to think about, because even if you're not in a touristy area of New York City with your rental properties, there's always that possibility that you're renting to somebody and then they're immediately either renting it out on Airbnb completely, or they're renting out rooms in the apartment on Airbnb or Craigslist or other areas to help subsidize their living. So it's worth jumping on these different platforms, zooming in on your area, seeing if there's anything available. And if you see photos that look pretty familiar, like your apartment that you're renting out to somebody, you're going to need to look into that and crack down on that. Even if it's not available that day, maybe put in a couple different dates, maybe further out too, to make sure that that apartment would show up if you're searching for it. So again, really interesting article. Check that out in the show notes. We'll link over to the article on New York Times by the author Luis. And go and check that out. Really interesting stuff if you have the time to read through the entire article. So that concludes this week's episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. Again, you can check out the resources on episode number 248. And if you guys ever come across any recent news stories or anything that you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to us here. You can reach out to me via email, eric@rentprep.com. And as always, you can connect with us in the Facebook group, Rent Prep for Landlords. A lot of cool stuff going on there. We've changed the way that people can access that group. The way you can access the group now is if you have a Rent Prep account, you share your email that you use as the login there when you try to join the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. The reason we did that is we have had concerns of people saying that there are renters in the group or people that shouldn't be in the group. And when you sign up for a Rent Prep account, it asks you for a lot of information. So we're doing this as a safety measure to try to keep renters out of the group and keep the discussion keep the discussion helpful for landlords and real estate investors, and not about, a renter dealing with a renter situation that they could find a different Facebook group that would be appropriate for. So again, join that group if you haven't joined that yet. And until next week, guys, have a great week. Enjoy your weekends if you're listening to this before the weekend. And look forward to catching up with you next week. All right, take care.